At this point, this is probably beating on the bones that was once a dead horse, but it probably comes to no surprise that I, like many others, did not care for The Last Jedi. I mean, much at all. Naturally, what stood out the most is the disgraceful treatment of Luke as a character. He went from being a hopeful Jedi who risked everyone because he saw some good in his father, to a jaded cynic who almost killed his nephew because he saw a little bad in him. The question is there a character existing in fiction that Johnson could have turned to use as a role model for how Luke could have been? Well, I don't know. I can't imagine where we'd find a former protagonist who lost his hand and after 50 years became a support character with a lot of facial hair and a prosthetic hand. Oh wait, one actually exists. Joseph Joestar of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. He was the protagonist in the second part, lost his hand to the final bad guy, and had a 50-year skip where he's an old man support character with facial hair and a prosthetic. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The one big difference is that, unlike Luke, Joseph Joestar is treated with a great deal more respect. I know that has something to do with the same writer still writing both parts, but even so, it's an example of how to do an aging protagonist very well. In Part 2, otherwise known as Battle Tendency, Joseph Joestar is a cocky young man who excels at Hamon and tends to be headstrong, in both the good and bad senses of the term. He demonstrated a great deal of cleverness, often using very strategic and cunning methods of taking down his opponent, a real contrast to the chivalrous brawler Jonathan of Part 1. Cut to Part 3, also known as Stardust Crusaders. Joseph's a great deal older now and technically no longer the protagonist, but the show and manga do essentially pass the torch in a sense. What I mean by that is that the show starts out focusing on him and then he has to deal with his grandson's evil spirit problem. After that, of course, the show firmly settles on more his grandson being the protagonist. Despite this, however, Joseph Joestar still acts a lot like his old self, although changed a little over time. He's also become something of a mentor figure and even shows genuine battle cleverness from time to time like he used to in Part 2. The fight with Empress is essentially one big love letter to fans of Part 2, even down to the "what you'll say next is" line.
Next you'll say, "Please stop it, I beg you!"
Please just stop it! I beg you! Ah!
Often, Joseph will serve as something of comic relief, especially with his bouts of English. Oh my god!
Oh my God!
Though his grandson has obviously taken the reins from him as the strong one, Joseph still acts as essentially the group's leader due to his personality and experience. This is how you do a former protagonist turned side character well. Joseph has obviously changed somewhat with age, but he's still the clever goof he's always been. How much that shows is determined by the episode, but even so. You can still tell it's the same person in Part 3 as Part 2. Now compare this to Luke, who couldn't be more different from The Last Jedi compared to the original trilogy. As I mentioned before, Luke went from being very hopeful and very heroic, self-sacrificing, who saw the good in someone as wicked as Vader, to just a bitter old hermit who almost tried to kill his nephew and now believes there's no hope.
You know there is good in you. The Emperor hasn't driven it from you fully.
He would bring destruction and pain and death at the end of everything I love because of what he will become. For the briefest moment of pure instinct, I thought I could stop it.
Granted, Luke gained something akin to hope by the end of The Last Jedi, but he still chooses to berate Kylo rather than try to see the good in him. Even at his strongest in The Last Jedi, Luke acts completely counter to how the original trilogy Luke would have acted, to the point that even Mark Hamill had constant disagreements with Rian Johnson over it.
I almost had to think of Luke as another character. Maybe he's Jake Skywalker. He's not my Luke Skywalker.
Wrapping this up, my point is that Joseph Joestar is a great example of how Rian Johnson should have treated Luke, at least in my opinion. It's not like he didn't have quite a long time to learn about it either. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3 wrapped up in 1992, around 25 years before The Last Jedi would see a release in theaters. I think it might actually have been better had they started this trilogy in a similar way as Stardust Crusaders 2, with Luke and Leia learning about a promising young Force sensitive who just needs a little guidance to be able to harness her abilities the proper way. At least then we wouldn't have the magically perfect at everything and without a purpose Rey that we ended up getting, but we can talk about the shortcomings of Rey's character some other time. Anyway, this is just my 2 cents on things, and it's not like we can do much about it now. Maybe Episode 9 will be good, but like Episode 8 Luke, I don't exactly have much in terms of hope. I hope you prove me wrong, J.J. Abrams, but you're gonna have to really wow us with Episode 9 to make up for the disgrace of Episode 8.